Do you remember the first time you saw race? Growing up, I grew up in a Southern California suburb whose population is 63.6% Asian. I know what you're thinking. That's a lot of Asians. And it's true. I had a very typical ABC childhood. And for those non-Asians in the room, ABC stands for American-born Chinese. So when I wasn't studying at SAT school, you could typically find me at the mall taking studio pictures or hanging out at boba shops. And in high school, everyone took AP classes, and we thought marching band was cool. And for the most part, despite growing up in a very Asian suburb, I had no concept of race. As a kid, I was using labels like short, fast runner, likes hot Cheetos to describe myself and my friends. But black, white, Chinese, those were labels that had never crossed my mind. But times change, and so do kids. And eventually the labels we used went from has blonde highlights to has slanted eyes. I was 10 when I first saw race. It was the first week of middle school, and my friends and I were so excited to be big, bad middle schoolers. We had staked out our spot. Every morning, we would buy breakfast burritos and eat them in front of the pillar outside of the locker room. But one morning, I noticed my friends sitting at a different pillar. And as I made my way over, they started to whisper to each other. And as I got closer, they suddenly all started running. I was a kid, so naturally I thought we were playing tag, and I assumed I was it. So I chased them, but every time I got close, they kept running and running and running. Eventually, the bell rang, and as we made our way towards homeroom, I grabbed my friend Brian by his backpack, and I asked him why everyone was running away from me. Brian shrugged me off and simply sneered, "Don't you get it? We don't want to be friends with you. Go find other chinks to be friends with." I was 10. I had no idea what a chink was. All I knew was that my friends, the same ones I had spent countless birthdays and sleepovers with, had cast me aside simply because I looked different than them. I was a kid, but that morning changed me. I spent the rest of my young adult life searching for comfort and safety among other kids who look like me. And it wasn't until I moved to New York 3 years ago that I started to challenge this story that had defined my life for nearly 2 decades. It took living in a city as diverse as New York and finding my community through Slant'd for me to reclaim my story and celebrate my Asian American identity. Carl Jung once said, "Our collective and unconscious carry an idea of stories. They form the springs of our identity. They provide depth and breadth to who we are." Stories are the foundation of our identity. They have the power to give us voice and to help us be seen. The Co-Intelligence Institute introduced this idea of story fields, which are narratives that influence and shape the awareness and behaviors of individuals and collectives associated with them. Story fields frame what we think is real, acceptable, and possible. In essence, this really means that they shape how others view us, but more importantly, how we view ourselves. And if stories are such a powerful form of self-expression, what happens when these stories get distorted? For many Asian Americans, our stories were written for us, not by us. The model minority myth, good at math, tiger mom. These stereotypes often overshadow the full spectrum of the Asian American narrative. And for a culture that tends to save face, we rarely dive into the deeper, darker stories. For example, I remember how surprised I was to learn that Asians have the highest poverty rate in New York City and the highest suicide rate among college students. These are just two of the many untold but very real stories within the Asian American narrative that simmer quietly below the surface. And as a person of color, I relinquished my power by allowing others to write my story for far too long. A classmate wrote a chapter on body image when she called me a wall, a person with no boobs and a flat butt. My father wrote a chapter on education when he insisted that I turn down my college acceptance just so he wouldn't have to pay for my tuition. And a stranger wrote a chapter on sexuality when he catcalled me chicachina and reduced me down to a fetish. For decades, these stories defined my self-worth, and I lost my sense of self. But when I started to challenge these stories from a place of open vulnerability, I began to realize there was so much left to be rewritten. When I started to see my differences as points of character, I began to reclaim my truth. And when I started to let go of the stories that no longer served me, I began to feel alive. The beginnings of our stories may have been written for us, but we don't have to let them define us. This goes for anyone who's ever felt misrepresented, misunderstood, or invisible. Challenging your story from a place of open vulnerability empowers you to connect deeper with yourself and others, creating the space to redefine the story fields of your community.
Redefining the story fields of our community is a mission that Krystie and I embarked on last year. Inspired by our own stories of our Asian American identities, we published a literary magazine featuring the stories of 22 Asian Americans across the country. Since then, Slant'd has blossomed into a media company, and we've seen how these personal stories can start to shift an entire community's narrative. In January, we attended a women's retreat for Asian American creators in Seattle, Washington, organized by the Cosmos, a community that empowers Asian women to lead their best lives. 19 Asian American women gathered into one house for one weekend to ponder the question, what does it look like for Asian American women to flourish and thrive? Asian American women are an incredibly powerful cohort of the American population. According to a 2017 study done by Nielsen, we have high levels of job creation and entrepreneurship, are expected to have $1.2 trillion in buying power by 2021, and over-index on travel, education, and technology. Yet, companies and institutions don't really pay attention to us. So we decided to do something about it. That weekend, we shared personal stories from the untouched, cobwebby corners of our lives, from our deepest fears to our highest aspirations. We talked about how we prioritize pillars like career, creativity, finances, relationships, self-care, politics, and representation, and how that might look different in our ideal worlds. We brainstormed what we want the Asian American movement to look like, feel like, and evoke in others. And as I sat around the common room of that Airbnb, I realized something significant. These are stories we've heard time and time again. For example, one woman named Jennifer shared her lunchbox moment. Jennifer immigrated from China to Portland, Maine when she was 5 years old, and she was the only Asian kid in her entire school system, from elementary school all the way up to high school. Every day, Jennifer's mother would lovingly pack her lunch. One of those lunches being homemade ramen, with chicken broth, mushrooms, bok choy, and a boiled egg. And every day, Jennifer would be mortified to eat it in the school cafeteria. The aroma of sesame oil wafted through the air, inciting her classmates to spew mean comments about the unfamiliar sight and smell of food so different than your standard all-American lunches. But Jennifer's lunchbox moment came with a twist. One day, a curious classmate spoke up and said, "Hey, can I try your pasta?" She tried it, and it was delicious, obviously. And within a week, Jennifer was trading her mother's homemade ramen for bites of her classmates' Lunchables, Doritos, and PB&Js. For the first time, Jennifer stepped into her Asian American identity, and the cafeteria transformed into a safe space where she could proudly share her food and her culture. This lunchbox moment is one of the many narratives we hear throughout the Asian American experience. We hear stories about reconciliation with our immigrant parents and what it's like to bear the burden of achieving the American dream. We hear stories about learning to be open with mental health when we've traditionally been taught to see emotion as a sign of weakness. We hear stories about the model minority myth and how its complexity and nuance have affected our careers. These stories create a collective identity that encompasses all of our lives. It creates a community. And the community I felt that weekend in Seattle was on a whole new level, a level I didn't even know existed until that weekend. Imagine walking into a room of 19 people whom you've never met before, yet who all look so familiar. Imagine leaving that weekend and realizing you don't even know what everyone does for a living because your conversations went so much deeper than that. Imagine being able to instantly identify with the personal stories of 19 strangers because you realize that their stories are also your stories. This is the power of storytelling. When we share our personal stories, we build empathy with others, and we discover how our experiences overlap, because they always do, and how you can use those common threads to uplift each other and cultivate something greater than yourself. This is our community. It is an effortless sisterhood, an environment that made me feel like I wasn't a minority, a collective of 19 fiery, powerful women who are committed to helping each other thrive and who inspire me and Krystie to build something for all of us. And it started with storytelling.
So we'd like to challenge you. What's your story? It starts by getting openly vulnerable and having the courage to ask yourself, what is my story? And is it helping me flourish and thrive? At Slant'd, we believe that storytelling fuels personal growth. And one of the most fulfilling parts about being editors is witnessing this messy and beautiful process of self-discovery. We enjoy watching these stories evolve with the writers themselves. And if we're lucky, we get the immense privilege of witnessing self-actualization happen right before our very eyes.
How can I use my story to uplift and mobilize my community? For us, our story sparked the creation of Slant'd, which not only serves as a creative platform for Asian Americans to discover and liberate their true selves, but it also fosters deep human connections with the greater community. So ask yourself, who is my community, and how can I encourage my people to share our stories? When we published issue 1, we saw those stories have a ripple effect. They've made people realize that they're never alone, even through the toughest, most uniquely personal challenges, because someone has been there before. They're a step towards changing the narrative about Asian Americans. They give our community a voice and help us be seen. They give us the tools to shape our own future.
So we'd like to invite you to reclaim your story and use it to find your community. Start a blog, attend an open mic night, record a podcast with your friends. Anything to get your story out there. Together, we have the power to change the narrative. So let's use our stories to celebrate the diversity that makes us human. Thank you.